Hello and welcome to JavaScript Programming, Intro to Programming the DOM. I'm Scott McLeod and we're going to walk through some abilities to manipulate the document object model. The main takeaways of today's video, first of all, an introduction to the document object model, or DOM, which allows us to manipulate elements of the web page in JavaScript. And this includes reacting to events such as a user clicking on the web page. And we'll be interacting with functions. And a couple of the document object model's very useful methods. One is called getElementById, which allows us to get our hands on any HTML element within our page based on its ID. Also, a useful property for manipulating the existing HTML on the page is the InnerHTML property. We'll see examples of these later. And one of the main takeaways is the elimination of the annoying prompts and alerts that have been a part of our scripts for the introductory portion of our course. So that's a good thing. Now, before we start diving into DOM-related code, let's see if we can get a little bit of an idea of what the DOM really is. So here's an image showing you various different HTML pieces in a web page, and the document object model just basically gives us the ability to treat this whole document as an object with properties and methods and allow us to manipulate it. So for example, here's a piece of code that we might use in order to get our hands on some part of the document, such as document.getElementById. So getElementById, as mentioned earlier, is a method of the document, and if you pass it age, you're saying, get me the HTML element that has the ID of age. So if you have somewhere in your HTML an ID of age on a particular heading or text box or paragraph or whatever, then getElementById will find it and return it to you. And then in this case, if it's a text box, I might be interested in what's been typed into that text box, and that would be the value property of that element. So once we get our hands on some of these various properties and methods and what they do, it's going to open up a lot of opportunities for us to manipulate web pages beyond anything that we imagined so far. So let's get to the code. Okay, so here's our starting point. This code's already out there for you, and let's take a look at what it does. It's not particularly sophisticated. It doesn't do much at all as far as the document object model, and that's what we're going to build into it. It also doesn't have any functions yet. So if we take it from line 9, beginning of the body elements, we see we have a heading followed by a paragraph, including an image. And then we get into the script. On line 12 through 23, we have some JavaScript statements in there. We first of all have a constant. This is going to be a script that calculates the cost of your semester's education based on the number of units you're taking. So in this case, we're using a prompt to ask the user how many units they're taking. We then just kind of parse float that so that in case it was not entered as proper input, we're going to do a little conversion on that and then actually calculate the cost based on this constant of $40 per unit, we're assuming. So that calculates out, and we have declared units and cost as variables. So here's the first usage of cost to hang on to that calculated value. And then we have two document.writes, which will produce the output. So the first document.write says you're taking so-and-so number of units, and at $40 per unit, your cost is, and then that's the result of our calculation. And we're fixing decimal places to 2 in the first place because units could be partial, like not only 1.5 or 3 or 4, as we might be accustomed to, but also possibly something like 1.25, just a possibility of 2 decimal places. And then, of course, the cost setting to 2 decimal places is more about the fact that we're talking about money, and so it'll be dollars and cents with 2 decimal places. So let's take a look at how this, by the way, my editor here is brackets, in case you're interested to follow along exactly as I am. I'm going to use its live preview option here so that we can run this and see what it looks like. So the first thing it does is prompt the user for the number of units. Let's keep the math simple here and just enter 2. And so notice, by the way, we see nothing on the page having anything to do with headings or paragraphs or whatever at all. No images, nothing. When I OK that prompt, then the rest of the page displays, as well as the document.writes that produce the results. And so we see the cost of education heading, followed by the paragraph that includes the image, and then the two document.writes indicating that we're taking 2 units, 2.00, and at our constant $40 per unit, the cost is $80, and 2 decimal places there as well. Pretty much what we expect. So we want to improve on this existing script, not in terms of the calculations or the display, which are fine, or the image, which we'll do, but instead we want to look at input without the prompt and do that with a form where we're going to respond to the user's click and then calculate. And we want to allow the user to see what's on the page before the prompt shows up. So those are some of the things that we're looking to improve, and we'll do that with some code changes here. So let's start working on that. The first thing we're going to do is try to take this longer script here and break it down into a function which does a fair amount of the work instead. And then we'll just call that function. So this is not completely necessary, and it's not really bringing in the DOM quite yet, but it's a step in that direction because our DOM will use this function too. So first of all, I'm going to go up into the head area, and I'm going to create a script there. So my script tags are there, and I'm going to bring a lot of the code up into that script as part of the function, but some aspects of it we'll leave behind. For example, we'll leave the prompt down here in the script area. So that said, let's begin the function. The function's going to actually do what? It's going to calculate as well as display the result. So it's going to do a little bit of both. Normally we try to keep our functions to like one major task, like the calculation, and then maybe another function to do the display. But in this case, just going to throw that all in there, keep things simple with just one function. So it's going to then have a longer name of calculate and display cost. And we'll have one parameter that it's passed, and that'll be the units that were input. And so its job is to calculate the cost and then to display the units and cost. Okay, and that function, of course, has a begin and end brackets. It might be a good idea to comment what this function is supposed to be doing. Given units, it calculates the cost and displays it. When you give a good name like calculate and display cost, then your comment is almost redundant. All right, now we are in the function, and I want to bring in basically pretty much everything that was already in the script. We'll copy and paste, and then we'll eliminate some of it as needed. I'm not going to cut it quite yet. I'm just going to bring everything in, and then we'll consider what we need here and what we need down below. So the constant we're going to need in the function because that's part of the calculation, which is definitely happening here. So we'll keep the const. Now the variables, units and cost. It doesn't make sense to have the units anymore because the units are already part of our parameters. So we're going to eliminate that, leave the cost. After all, the cost is calculated here, so that needs to stay. We don't need the prompt. Now, one question would be, do we keep the parse float here or do we do it down below? And we'll just leave that in the function. Calculation's good, and the document.writes are fine for now. So now when we get down to the script that we had before, we can eliminate the things that are now part of the functions. One would be the constant. Another would be cost, because that's taken care of inside the function. We do need the prompt down here. The parse float, the calculation, and the document.writes are all no longer needed because they're in the function. So that brings us down to just 2 statements in our script. The declaration of our units and the initial setting of the units based on the input coming from the prompt. Okay, let's save. And then we're going to preview this. The point of this preview is just to make sure it's still doing what it was doing before. Now it's doing it with a function. So let's just say 5 units this time, and with a $40 per, that would be $200 we're expecting. But what happened? We're not seeing the results. So we did something wrong. So what did we do wrong? by we, I mean me. If you haven't figured it out yet, we never actually called the function. So our function's name is calculate and display costs, and we never called it. So keep that in mind, that your function doesn't get activated unless you specifically call it. And when should it be called? After we get the units from the prompt. So we're going to call upon that function pass the units that we just got and let it calculate and display. Okay, let's try that again. So this time, 5 units and $200 result. So it looks like it's doing exactly what it did originally, except now it's being done with a function. Okay, so now that we're comfortable with this function, we're going to move on to something involving the DOM. So what I'd like to do next is eliminate the prompt. Right? That's part of the issue there, is that it's just not a good interface for users to deal with. Plus, we can't see the H1 and the paragraph when we're answering the question. So now we're going to just rewrite some HTML to create a form on the page for the user to input using a text box instead of the prompt. So let's go in here to what I have as line 27 now, and we'll begin to create that form. So we're going to start with form tags. Really, I want a text box and a button that they can click when they're ready for the calculation to take place. So inside the form, we're going to have a couple of paragraphs. In the first paragraph, I'll ask them to enter the number of units. And this is where we'll have the text box. And in HTML, a text box, a button, a checkbox, these things are all using the input tag. And the difference between one and the other, from the browser's point of view, is it's all based on the type that you set up. So you can see a lot of our choices here. In our case here, we want a text box. So you can just kind of scroll through all of the form elements that begin as an input and then differentiate based on the type. We'll end that with a space and a slash as we did the image, since it doesn't really have a closing input tag. Now we want our second paragraph. And this is where the button will come into play. Again, we'll have an input and type equal button. Again, space slash. You can close your input tags without the slash in HTML5, but it's kind of a holdover from previous versions that many people prefer to continue with that. Anyhow, that will complete our form for now. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. It's going to pretty much produce the same thing as before in terms of the prompt, since we didn't take that out. But at least we can see when it's all done what things look like, and then make some corrections. So you can see here below the image, we do have this text box that we could enter some number of units, and we have a button here, but the button doesn't have anything on it. We can click it, but nothing happens. So there's a couple of issues there. So let's come back and address those issues. So first of all, if we want our button to say something on it, and this is the button that is going to be clicked when the user wants the calculations to take place. So we're going to have a value property on a button. The value property is just what you want the button to actually have said on it. So we'll say calculate cost. We're going to now eliminate the prompt. Get that out of there. That's something that's just been an annoyance. We'll eliminate more of this script later. Let's go ahead and see if our changes have had any good effect so far. Okay, no more prompt. We can enter whatever units we want. We can see our button with calculate cost on it. Notice we're still getting not a number coming through because of we no longer have the prompt. So we have some more work to do because we're still basically calling this with no units yet. So now we need to add the event. So when the user clicks on this button to calculate the cost, that's when we have an opportunity to react to it and trigger the calling of this calculate and display cost function. The way to do that is inside of the object where they're going to be clicking. If they're going to click on that button, then the button is where we have to actually react to that event. We do that with something called an onClick. There are different ways to do this actually. You can capture events in a couple of different ways. But for us right now, we'll do it right here in the actual element, the button itself. So the onClick, basically this means that when this button is clicked, this JavaScript code between these quotes is going to be triggered. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to call this calculate and display cost function to do the calculations. But unlike the prompt where we got the units, now where are the units to pass it? Well, the units to pass it are sitting in the text box. Okay, so how can we get our hands on whatever's in the text box in order to pass it to that function? Well, the way to do that is by using some of these DOM features that we were talking about earlier. Before we get into the long-winded DOM statements, let's just put alert. I know we said we're going to get rid of alerts, but let's just put an alert in here to say I was clicked. Okay, this just to confirm that this on-click works. So now when we click that button, we should see an alert that says I was clicked. Hopefully that will work. And in the meantime, we can comment out this function call so that doesn't continue to bother us. Let's see if those changes make a difference here. So no prompt, now we're getting no bad output here. We're able to enter our value, and now when I click calculate cost, I should get the alert. I click it, and here comes the alert. So now we know that on-click is working. So I like to encourage you to code little bits at a time and to confirm that things are working. So now that I know that this is working and it's happening when it should, the on-click event is triggering our code at the right time. So now what we want to do is see if we can get our hands on the number of units in the text box. Now, if you recall before, there's something called getElementById. And if we use that, we can use it to grab the value out of this text box. However, it's getElementById. So we need to put an ID in here. So whatever we put as the ID is what we'll refer to when we're trying to get it back out. So for example, it's a text box, so I'm going to go with txt as the beginning 3 characters, and then what's inside of it is units. So I'm going to call it txt units. That's the ID I will use. Now on the on-click, let's see if we can grab it. Okay, believe it or not, we're going back to an alert. I want to see if I can alert the value that's inside the text box. So to do that, inside the alert, I'm going to do a document dot get element by ID, and then I'm going to pass in the ID. The ID is here, text units. I'll just copy and paste it to make sure I don't misspell it. We've got to be careful about our quotes and our parentheses and make sure that we are opening and closing them in the right places. So if this works correctly, what this will do is return to me the element itself, which is the text box. It's not going to return to me the value that's in the text box. It's just going to return me the actual object of the text box itself. And there's all kinds of properties that I might be wanting to look at there, not just the value of it. So knowing that, I'm going to go ahead and try to work with it anyway. So let's see what happens. We're going to enter in a 3 as the number of units. We'll click calculate cost, and look what happens in the alert. It says what I'm trying to output there is an object, and it's an HTML input element. So that's pretty interesting. I didn't try to get the 3 out of there. I just wanted to see what would happen if I took the whole element itself and tried to display it. So it's basically saying here, hey, I can't display a text box to you, it's the whole thing. So this the best it could do was just say, hey, it's an input element, you know. Do something more with it if you want to see it. So what I have to do then is take that and get the dot value property out of it. So this is the value of the element, and that's what's typed in. That'll be the 3 if that's what was typed in. Now, whatever I type in, let's go 4, when I click calculate cost, now I want to see the 4. There it is. So we're almost done now in terms of being able to get the actual calculations back that we had before. So I am now able to get whatever the units are entered into the text box out of this thing. Of course, I don't want an alert, but what do I want? I want a call to calculate and display cost instead. So I'm going to copy that and just basically replace the alert with calculate and display cost, because both of them want the units. And this should now trigger the function to be called when it's clicked, and it will pass it the units. I now no longer need any part of this script, so we can get rid of that. And we can go ahead and save and try this. So let's go ahead now and enter like a 2, calculate cost, and what happens? Okay, it's interesting because instead of any prompts, instead of any alerts, we're actually getting the right values, right? I entered 2 as the units, so it should be $80. It all looks good, but what happened there? We can't see the original page. Why is that? Because we're still using document.writes, and the page has already been rendered completely in the browser. So let's review that situation. What happens first? The browser comes through, sees this function, doesn't execute it yet, because it's a function. It just kind of makes note of the function's name and knows that it may be triggered later. Goes into the body, shows the headings and the paragraphs and the form elements, and actually completes the whole page. Then we come in and start entering values and clicking buttons, and it's at that point where these on-click activities take place. So the page has already been fully complete, and then suddenly we come along and start doing document.writes later. You can't do that once the page is closed in the browser and completed. You can't do document.writes back into it, or you lose the original page and it starts a new one. So we need to find another way to get this same display out there without using document.write. And to do that, we have some other options. One is, as we talked about earlier in the PowerPoint, we have something called InnerHTML, and that gives us the ability to manipulate or modify the existing HTML without losing the current page. And so let's work now up in the function to replace the existing document.writes. Now, where are we going to put the results? This document.write before was going at the bottom of the page, because that's where the script was. But now we can't really do that unless we have something down there already on the page to kind of hook onto and manipulate. So what we're going to do is create a div down here at the bottom. It could be really anything. Paragraph would be fine. I'm going to put a div there, and I'm going to give it an ID so that we can refer to that ID kind of like we did before with the text box. And this will be an ID of pretty much anything you want to call it. This is where our output is going to go. So I'm going to go ahead and just use that as the ID. And then we don't necessarily have to put anything in that area initially, because we'll fill it up with the display later. But just so we can see it on the page, for now, in this demo version, I'll go ahead and say this is where the output will go, so that we can see it ourselves as we test it. That will allow us now to come up here, and instead of the document.writes, after our calculation has been made, after the user has clicked the button and we're calculating the cost, and now we want to display it, now we can use the getElementById method again to get our hands on the HTML of this element, the div, and put the output there. All right, so let's go. So it's document dot getElementById, and you can see I'm getting a lot of help here that I wasn't getting before. I wasn't getting it before because I was buried inside many layers deep into this quotations, and it was a little too much for brackets to figure out, but I'm getting it here. So document.getElementById, and now we have to give the actual ID, which is output, and then dot. So now what? Well, what do we have on our hands? You have to keep asking yourself, where am I in this document object modeling point? So if I've done a getElementById and I've passed the ID, I have the actual element now. So I'm putting a dot here. That would be a property of this div, and the property I want is InnerHTML. By inner, it means not the divs itself, but whatever's inside. So in this case, it's inside the inner part of the HTML. So we're inside the div. It could be other paragraphs, it could be any other HTML that's inside. It's just not the divs themselves in this case, or whatever element you're dealing with. So what do we want to do with that? Well, I want to set that equal to whatever my document.writes were doing before. So these same paragraphs. So basically, I want to take these two and kind of add them together and put them in there. So I don't need the document.writes. We'll take basically everything that was quoted in there before. So whatever the document.write was doing is good. I don't want to change it. It was producing the right looking stuff. I just want to kind of add the two together is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take all that the document.writes were doing before, add them together into one big long string. And that's all. If that's too much, you can break it into a couple of different statements, but we're just going to kind of put it all together there. Now I don't need the document.writes. After all, they were doing more harm than good before. And maybe a semicolon at the end of all this. So I'm putting two paragraphs out there, and I'm setting the InnerHTML to that. So I'm basically putting two paragraphs inside this div. What's going to happen to the existing, this is where the output will go? Well, it's going to be replaced. Just like if you had a variable like x equal 2 and then you assigned it 3, it loses the 2 and takes on the new value 3. So the InnerHTML is going to lose that and be replaced with all of this good stuff. And it looks like somehow or other I just missed a quote here. We got to tack on a single quote right there between the pluses. Okay, I somehow missed that. So let's try now one more time. Let's go ahead and enter a 10. Calculate the cost. There it is. You're taking 10 units. At 40 per unit, your cost is $400. So notice that it really looks exactly like it did before with the document.writes, and that's because we use this exact same HTML. We just got it in there through the InnerHTML property instead of the document.writes that we're no longer working at that point. So if you want to build a page that reacts to the user's clicks or any other events that the user might be doing, then you really can't use document.writes there because the page has already been completely rendered and you're in a situation where you need to use the DOM in order to manipulate things on the page, such as InnerHTML as we just saw. Come back to the code here one more time. Okay, so here's one last look at the finished code where we can see that we've completely transformed the original simple script using prompts and document.writes to this DOM-aware script that uses forms and triggers function calls through events and has a much more powerful ability to manipulate the existing document, which is just really your toe in the water of all the ocean of capabilities that JavaScript has to manipulate the DOM. So the more you learn about the DOM and its various properties and methods, the more empowered you will be to manipulate to your needs the existing page that you're working with. So hopefully you found this interesting and useful. And until the next time, thank you.